Tuesday, September 18th, 2018, Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. This morning I'd like to talk about the Bank of England, a subject I cover a lot on my channel, central banking, the fraudulent nature of central banking, how it's a monopoly. But today I want to talk about who really owns the Bank of England. Some of you have asked me to touch upon this subject. I have spoken about it. I made a video earlier this summer in June when I went to the Bank of England Museum. I found out someone really interesting had shares in the Bank of England, and I'll talk about that later. So before I touch upon the Bank of England ownership, I will look at the markets this morning, see where we are and what's been going on. It's just gone past 9 a.m. London, so let's have a look. Spot gold right now is at 1198.50, down about $2.50. The high has been 1202.90, the low 1195.60. So not still in a range, basically, the price of gold here. In the range around 1200. Silver as well. Yesterday it looked like early on it was starting to outperform gold again, but didn't really do much. We're right now at 14.15, down 2 cents. Range has been 14.06 to 14.23. Yesterday the low was 14, so had a little bit of a higher low this morning. The Dow future is 26,090. Up 30 points. S&P 500 is up 4 at 28.92, and the Nasdaq 100 future is up 11 at 74.43. The fiat currencies, the pound is down 10 pips, so basically unchanged, 131.47. The euro is unchanged as well, 116.85. And the dollar is unchanged against the yen, 111.91. So markets are fairly quiet this morning, the currency markets. Yesterday, the dollar went down quite substantially against the pound and the euro. That helped gold trade higher, but then the gains in gold fizzled out towards the end of the day, which is something fairly normal for the U.S. markets. That's been, I think someone's done a study that if you bought gold even since 2000, every time the U.S. market came in, like let's say 8:30 New York time, and you sold it at the end of the day, you would have lost money in gold over these years, even though gold's gone from 250 to 1200. What else? The dollar is unchanged against the yuan, 687. So all very quiet in terms of the currencies. Crude oil is 68.50. WTI down about 0.25%. Emerging market currencies stuck around here. The dollar has rallied against the Turkish lira since last week. It's at 633. What about the bond market? Well, yesterday I was speaking to a friend of mine that's still in the city. He follows the bond market very closely. And at the time, the 10-year yield was at 301. So yesterday we went up to 301. I think 302 was the high. Right now it's at 299. So still stuck around that level. Bank of England. So some of my viewers have said, well, you haven't talked about this. You need to expose them. Who really owns the Bank of England? Well, the Bank of England was a private bank since its foundation in 1694 until 1946. There were shareholders at the Bank of England. Then they nationalized it in 1946, the UK government. And I even spoke in a video, which I'll put up in the cards and in the description below. I went to the Bank of England Museum, and there's some interesting things there. I found out that none other than George Washington owned shares in the stock of the Bank of England, mainly because his wife, Martha Washington. She was a widow, and her husband, when he died, left those shares in the Bank of England to Martha Washington, and then when she married George Washington, they became his. That's how it worked back then. And there's even at the museum, there's a notice. It says a dividend payment that George Washington received even during the the Revolutionary War. So yeah, George Washington was one of the shareholders of the Bank of England through his wife. So what does the Bank of England say now about the ownership of the Bank of England? So their website says here, who owns the Bank of England? For over 250 years, the Bank of England was a private bank owned by various shareholders. We were nationalized in 1946. Since then, we have been wholly owned by the UK government. Who were the original owners of the Bank of England? The governor and company of the Bank of England, better known as the Bank of England, was established by royal charter in 1694 to raise money to fund a war with France. Over 1,200 people purchased shares, at the time called bank stock, totaling 1.2 million pounds, which was the value of the government loan. The first shareholders came from a wide variety of backgrounds, trades and professions: carpenters and grocers, merchants, doctors, knights, and royalty. So you see that there were many owners, shareholders in the Bank of England from all walks of life. And it says here, when was the Bank of England nationalized? Although we, and I quote, although we were still privately owned in the mid-19th century, from the mid-19th century onwards, we started to behave less like other private banks and more like what today would be called a central bank. For example, we had a monopoly on the issuance of banknotes in England and Wales and took responsibility for protecting the financial system. Not sure about that. We were nationalized by the government in 1946. Due to our importance to the economy, various other central banks across Europe passed from private to public ownership around this time. The other thing they say, who owns the Bank of England today? We are wholly owned by the UK government. The entire capital of the bank, around 14.6 million pounds, it's not much, is it? Is held by the Treasury Solicitor on behalf of HM Treasury. There are some misconceptions on the internet about the Bank of England today being owned by private families, the royal family, or run as a private corporation, but these stories are untrue. Although we are owned by HM Treasury, we carry out our responsibilities free from day-to-day political influence. The links below to our main website explain more about how we are governed. So there you go. Am I saying everything's great? It's the government that owns it. It's run by the people? No. I think ownership gives you control of an asset or an institution like a bank. But does it mean that you lose control if you lose ownership? I don't think so. And before I go into the control of the Bank of England, I'd just like to quote, of course, the founder of the Bank of England, what he said. And I quote, the bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing. So yeah, the Bank of England earns interest from the taxpayer on money that it creates out of nothing. And also, I would say the commercial banks and private banks that are part of the club, the Bank of England club, they're able to do the same. But the government isn't able to do the same because if the government could print money out of thin air and actually not charge any interest on it, then the taxpayer wouldn't have all this national debt lumbered upon them. So very rich people, very rich families, it's funny to say, but they don't own many assets. And you might ask, what do you mean? Well, when you look at the Forbes list of the richest people in the world, you get like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, but you never see a Rothschild or a Rockefeller. Why is that if they're worth trillions? Well, because it's all in trust, and they're only beneficiaries of these trusts. But ultimately, they control these trusts. They're directors a lot of times of companies that control the trust, and they benefit from it. So what I'm trying to say is that with the Bank of England, they might have been nationalized in 1946. They might have bought the shares of all the shareholders. But I would say the biggest shareholders, which are the bankers and some very important families, they still maintain control of the Bank of England. They're still in charge, in my opinion. Because if they weren't, then the government and the bank, they could just decide to issue money out of thin air without any interest. And that happened through the Treasury during World War One. The first part of World War One, it was called the Bradbury Pound. The UK Treasury started issuing debt-free notes, UK Treasury notes, much like the greenbacks, to finance the war. But by 1916, the bankers in the City of London and the Bank of England, they realized this was no good because they're going to lose a lot of business. So they got the UK government to stop that. So that's the Bradbury Pound. So let's look at, I think the best place to look is who have been the governors of the Bank of England since it was nationalized. So you start with a guy called Lord Cato, 1944 to 1949. So let's have a look at him. Lord Cato, Scottish businessman and later governor of the Bank of England. The interesting thing is that it says here, in 1928, he returned to London as a partner in the investment bank Morgan, Grenfell and Co. So that's the London arm of JP Morgan. So you see who was in control of the Bank of England even after it was nationalized. These kind of people. In 1946, he stayed on to 1949. Let's look at the next Bank of England governor, David Litton Cobbold, second Baron Cobbold. So he's a baron. He was the Bank of England governor from 1949 to 1961, so 12 years. That's a long time. Let's read a little bit about him. So his family, he's a member of the Litton family, Earls of Litton. So a very influential family going back hundreds of years. David Cobbold was an executive in the International Banking Department of Bank of London in South America. Does this guy, Baron Cobbold, look like a common person working in the interest of the British public? No. So who's next? Let's look at the next governor. Lord Cromer. Well, another lord. Let's have a look at Lord Cromer, who he really was. And that's why I think, the American founding fathers didn't like the title of nobilities, because a lot of times people hid behind these titles. He didn't really know who they were. So Lord Cromer doesn't sound very, bad or anything, but you look at who he really is. He's Roland Baring, excuse me, George Roland Stanley Baring. Well, Baring's Bank was probably one of the biggest shareholders in the Bank of England. Baring's Bank was the private bank who arranged for the Louisiana Purchase. They were one of the biggest private banks, most famous banks in England. Of course, they went bust in the mid-1990s, thanks to Nick Leeson. But I'll read here a little bit about Lord Cromer, or Roland Baring. Served as economic minister at the British Embassy in Washington, as well as holding executive directorships at the International Monetary Fund, IMF, excuse me, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So this guy became the governor of the Bank of England for 12 years. So who was really in control? Was it the people really after the Bank of England became nationalized, so to speak? So let's go to the next governor. Sir Leslie O'Brien, 1966 to 1973. So this guy actually, he rose through the ranks of the Bank of England. Don't think his family is too connected, but they do that just to try to mix things up. So that's, but he became a baron of Lothbury, which is near where the Bank of England is. But next one, Gordon Richardson. So he was governor of the Bank of England from 1973 to 1983, so 10 years. Let's have a look at this guy. So Gordon William Humphreys Richardson, Baron Richardson. He's another baron, former British banker, lawyer, and governor of the Bank of England. Who did he work for? Well, here we go. He became a director of J. Henry Schroeder and Co. in 1957, and later was chairman between 1962 and 73. Well, Schroeder is, like Barings, one of the biggest investments or merchant banks in the city of London. And then when he left the Bank of England, who did he join as a member of the advisory board? Morgan Stanley in 1984. And he was a member of the Pilgrim Trust. A lot of people talk about the Pilgrim Trust, that they control the silver market. Next, governor of the Bank of England, let's have a look. Robin Lee Pemberton, 1983 to 1993, so 10 years. Let's have a look at Mr. Lee Pemberton. Oh, he's another baron, Baron Kingsdown. Lee Pemberton was educated at St. Peter's Court, Eton College, Trinity College, Oxford. He eventually became chairman of the National Westminster Bank. Well, that's NatWest, which was had to be bailed out by us, the taxpayer. He was chairman of that bank. He became the governor of the Bank of England. Who is behind? What's the family behind National Westminster Bank? I haven't looked into it, but I could tell you they probably had a lot of shares in the Bank of England when it was nationalized. Oh, and he also served on the board of directors of the Bank for International Settlements. So, yeah, government owned but run and controlled by the bankers. And then you come to more recent. You get Eddie George. He came through the ranks. He didn't really come from a banking family, or he didn't work for one of the big banks. He started out at the Bank of England, but once he retired, he was employed by the Rothschild family. For some reason it doesn't mention that here, but I know of that. And then Mervyn King also was more in academia. Carney now, Goldman Sachs, there you go. He worked for Goldman Sachs and now he's in charge. The other thing I would note is that he went to Jesuit high school in Canada, St. Francis Xavier School. So he's a Catholic, but doesn't seem to mind printing money out of thin air or usury. Maybe it's because he's a Jesuit. A lot of people say the Jesuits are very influential. And to finish off, I'd just like to talk about the cashier of the Bank of England, because I noticed a few years ago there was a cashier called Merlin Lowther, I'm not sure how you pronounce this name. It's a very old English family, North of England family. They are the Lonsdales. There's the Earl of Lonsdale, right? And this is a woman, she was the cashier of the Bank of England, Merlin Lowther. So even at that level, I'm sure the Lonsdale family or the Lowther family had a lot of shares in the Bank of England when it was nationalized. So there you go. It might be a nationalized bank, But it's the control that matters. I would say that the bankers and the very influential aristocratic families are still in charge, even though sometimes they do put someone in charge who doesn't come from the background. But you can bet that they are heavily under the influence of that kind of background. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share it, subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. You can also follow me on Steemit, DTube, and on Twitter. I'll talk to you later. Take care.